Hi, my name is Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York, a reflection on the sixth week of Easter season. And the text for this reflection are John chapter 15, verses 9 through 17, and the poem Perhaps the World Ends Here by Joy Harjo. Now, you won't be surprised if you've heard me before. You won't be surprised to hear that I have a totally different view than John of Jesus, from that famous bit we just heard from John 15. If you're a traditionalist, orthodox, fundamentalist, literalist, or in any other way resistant to a perspective on Jesus that does not conform to the widest swath of church teaching, then your money's going to be on John, not me. It won't matter to you when I point out that John didn't know Jesus any more than I do, or that John's inclusion as one of the four canonical Gospels was not without struggle and controversy back in the day. You will quite rightly point out that I have zero credibility and zero authority, and perhaps you will even scold me for being so presumptuous as to disagree with the gospel. To which I would agree. I got nothing in my favor, nothing, except that poem we just heard. What we have this morning is a beautiful contrast between John's vision of Jesus and the poet's description of what I think is a wonderful metaphor for Jesus and the realm of God. So let's dig into that contrast. John's Jesus says, I loved you as God loved me. I loved you as God loved me. That's powerful. It's equivalent to God's coo into Jesus' ear at his baptism, you are my beloved. I loved you as God loved me. In other words, no greater love has a human ever received. But then comes the contradiction. Remain in my love. That should make us wince, make our ears hurt. We have just been told, I say we, but it's actually told to the disciples, so we don't know even if John imagined Jesus was universalizing this or not. But we have just been told, by implication, that it's possible for us not to remain in his love. How? Well, John tells us that God's love of Jesus was conditional, dependent upon Jesus obeying God's commandments. Likewise, Jesus' love of his disciples, or us if we're hopeful, is also conditional. We must obey his commands if we wish to know the joy of being loved by Jesus as God loved him. If John had just had Jesus say, this is my commandment, love each other as I have loved you, and then follow that up as he does with the greatest love a person can have is to die for his friends. That would have been lovely. But instead, John wrapped it in a straitjacket of conditions. Keep my command, keep God's command, live in this box, and you will have the joy of love greater than anyone can know. Leave the box, leave the love. So that's John's view of Jesus and God, I suppose. I don't find that very compelling. But before I offer an alternative view, I don't want to go overboard with the hippy-dippy idea of unconditional love, because way back in Exodus, which, by the way, remember, is the beginning of our story, not Jesus, there is a big condition. God says to Moses, if you obey me, and if you keep my commandments, or my covenant, you will be my people, chosen from among all the nations. And there it is, a big fat condition right at the start of everything. We can hear that as a carrot and stick, as I believe John intends for it to be in his gospel, or we can hear it as a clear boundary, as in, do not abuse me in this relationship because I have a limit to what I will accept. Now, I prefer the latter, that God refuses to be in relationship with a planet full of creatures like us. God refuses to be in an abusive relationship with a planet full of creatures like us. It's not that God will stop loving us, but God will not save us either from the consequences of our choices. Instead, God offers us tough love, the kind that desperately hopes and relentlessly encourages us toward our better natures. But God does not enable our abuse and self-destruction, or God's. So, as I interpret it anyway, the built-in conditionality is not about loving us, but about setting appropriate limits on behavior and relationship. God doesn't stop loving us because we have abused the planet and climate change is upon us, but God won't fix it for us either. Now, every parent, sister, brother, aunt, uncle, grandparent understands this choice. We don't stop loving the person when we object to the behavior. In fact, often when we see someone that we love keep making unfortunate choices, our compassion is inflated, and it inflates our love even more. Tough love does not end at a condition. It sets a boundary on acceptance and loves fiercely, even through the powerlessness over the other person's decision-making. The presence of love remains in tough love, even when those toward whom the love is directed reject and abuse the boundaries of the relationship. The love remains present, even when the other person walks away from it by violating the boundaries. What makes the love tough is its willingness to hold those boundaries for the sake of itself and the one who is loved. To hold boundaries with love, is a holy love. We keep the love even as we enforce the boundaries. I submit that John's depiction is not tough love, but conditional, maybe even manipulative love. We get it if, and we are cut off from it if. Now, let's go to the contrasting image we had today, that is of the poet Joy Harjo, the kitchen table. The kitchen table is a metaphor for the place we gather with those that we love, and where we live through the joys and sorrows, the ordinary yet devastating anguish that conflict, achievement, and loss brings. It may be a dining room table, it may be a kitchen table, it may be a living room sofa, it might be an altar around which the spiritual community gathers and prays. My vision of Jesus' love is the table fellowship he hosted, in which people from all social and economic castes gathered and ate together. Men, women, and children, even though elsewhere they were segregated. Rich, poor, peasants, and artisans, even though elsewhere they were segregated. Reputable, privileged, outcast, and anonymous, even though elsewhere they were segregated. The table is an icon of Jesus' love. And while there may have been boundaries placed on what and how people treated one another, the edges of that table had no preconditions to the welcome. For me, it's the table, not the cross, that most fully captures the love within which we are held by God. For me, the kitchen table is the altar. And rather than treat the altar like some rarefied spectacle that should never be touched or only touched with kid gloves and adorned with silver and gold, it should be a table that has the look of life, having been relentlessly welcomed and lived hard at its edges. At Trinity Place, we don't have pews anymore, so we need to rub our prayers into the table and place our prayer stones on it and light our candles at it and gather around its edges where we can also look each other in the eyes. In short, God is present at the table that Jesus hosted, wherever it is. In God's presence, we are loved. We are beloved. There's no condition on God's presence. There's nothing we can do to push God's presence out of our lives or away from our table. That's the joy of God's love. We remain in it no matter what, even when we push ourselves away from it. We remain in it no matter what, even when we have rejected the beauty of God's justice for the grimy, slimy gluttony of our own self-centeredness. We remain in the presence of God's love no matter what we do, even though what we do does impact whether or not we can experience that love. The condition is not whether God is present and loving us or not. The condition is our choice to accept it or not. Accepting it also means trying to live in such a way as to reflect the presence of God's love. Because basically, to be a reflection of God's love is also to become part of God's presence. But even if and when we choose otherwise, and knowing us, it's always when, God continues to love us. God continues to be present with us. The joy of God's love is abiding presence. We can walk away from it, but we cannot lose it.